Hey everybody, this is Aeon of Ruin. It is a game that I have been trying to review for the past couple of weeks now, and as you can no doubt tell from the title of this video, it's just not working out in this particular case. The simple fact of the matter is that in order for me to properly review something, I have to finish the game, and I don't think I'm ever actually going to finish Wrath. Which is pretty weird considering that it is a retro throwback first-person shooter, and it goes a bit above and beyond most other retro throwback shooters, in the sense that it runs on the Quake 1 engine, more specifically, if I'm correct, the Dark Places source port, which has more advanced capabilities than just basic Quake 1 engine. So in theory, it's right up my alley. So what's the real problem here? Well, before I go into what the game actually is, let me give you a bit of background so you know exactly what we're dealing with here. It was developed primarily by Kill Pixel Games with assistance from Slipgate Ironworks. If you don't know who Slipgate Ironworks is, they got their start with the Rise of the Triad remake, which was a really janky mess. And then they went on to make the game Bombshell, which I covered in a multi-game MTO about twin-stick shooters a while back. So if you're interested, you can check that out. But the short version there is that Bombshell was not a very good game, and nobody really liked it. However, it was the introduction of the character Shelly Harrison, who would go on to star in the retro throwback FPS Aeon Fury, which is absolutely fantastic, and I very highly recommend both it and its expansion pack, Aftershock. Although I should note that Aeon Fury and its expansion pack were not developed by Slipgate Ironworks. I'm just giving you some context here. But more relevant to Slipgate themselves, more recently they have been the developers of a game called Graven, which was generally not all that well received. I haven't gotten around to it yet. I do have a copy. I'll be taking a look at it eventually. But the general reception of it has just not been very good. And they also did the Kingpin remaster, which was a real mess. And they also released very recently Phantom Fury, which I did a live commentary play of the demo of a while back, which apparently they have dramatically improved the game since that demo I played, so that's good, but it didn't bode well back then, and the game actually releasing so soon after that demo was available was real cause for concern, and as it turns out, apparently Phantom Fury is not very good, which is a real shame because that is the technical sequel to Aeon Fury. But of course, I'll eventually get around to Phantom Fury when I can. I'm not sure when that'll be right now, but it will happen eventually. But suffice to say, Slipgate Ironworks being involved in Aeon of Ruin after all of those games is definite cause for concern. But thankfully it seems like Slipgate's involvement is really just limited to helping polish up the game for final release and helping to port it to other systems. So the game was mostly developed by Kill Pixel, and then it was published by 3D Realms and Fulcrum Publishing, and it released into early access back in 2019 and got its full release in February of this year. Now, I did mess around with the game a bit during early access, but I decided to wait until the full release to make a video on it, and I never really made it very far into the game in early access anyway, just played through about a level or so and thought that it was promising, but it would be really more telling what they did with the final game. So now the final game's out. What are we dealing with? Well, like I said, it's a retro throwback FPS. It is on the Quake 1 engine, more specifically, if I remember correctly, Dark Places. And it looks good. It's got a lot of detail in environments. Everything's definitely styled to look like an actual retro shooter, so roughly late 90s graphics in terms of visual quality. But they've packed in more detail than would have been present back in the day, along with rather large environments for you to wander around and explore, and quite a lot more enemies than you would be used to from a Quake 1 engine game. And along with this retro look, they've also gone with a sort of combination of fantasy and sci-fi elements, although it does lean more into the fantasy elements than it does into the sci-fi. So you get things like enemies that shoot energy projectiles at you and look like they're bizarre sci-fi experiments, but then there's a lot of enemies that are basically just demons that charge at you and try to eat you and things like that. And most of the weapons have a very fantasy tinge to them as well. About the most mundane thing in the game is the shotgun, which is basically a double-barreled hammer-fired coach gun, but with an extra bit on it for the secondary fire function that allows you to fire a blast that will actually split apart into two projectiles that will then go off, and when they hit something, they will burst into a shower of pellets that goes all over the place. But apart from that glowing bit that's part of this secondary fire function, it just looks like a regular double-barreled shotgun, more or less, just with a bit of a fantasy aesthetic to it. And the rest of the weapons run the gamut from more organic weapons like the cyst launcher on up to clearly more technological stuff like the slag cannon, but none of it really goes beyond roughly steampunk levels of technology. And that all generally works pretty well. The game looks good and runs well, and when you move over into sound design, you get some sound effects that are actually pretty decent. The gun and explosion sounds are solid, and their effect on target is solid as well. Not only do you have the visual effects of enemies just getting blasted into meaty chunks or having their arms or whatever blown off, but the sound effects for those enemies getting torn apart are pretty decently chunky as well, so they've done a good job with that all around. The one problem that really comes to mind with the presentation, however, is the music. And that's not to say that it's bad, but rather, if you watch the trailers, it gives you the impression that you're going to be dealing with a lot of heavy metal type music, and that's just not what you get in Wrath Aeon of Ruin. Nearly all of the soundtrack is actually just ambient stuff that certainly enhances the atmosphere in calmer moments while you're wandering around and doing stuff. But in the middle of combat, it really doesn't do anything for the game at all, and it's just a weird oversight there. I'm not entirely sure if it's due to engine limitations or what, but this game would have definitely benefited more from having a more dynamic soundtrack, where when you get into fights, the music actually kicks up, instead of just having this constant, atmospheric, ambient stuff. But apart from that, they've done a very good job with the presentation. But of course, what really matter are the story and the gameplay, and the story is pretty much non-existent, which is very much in keeping with games of this type, these retro throwback first-person shooters. All you really need to know is that you are someone who is referred to as the Outlander, and you have been chosen by the One to save the old world. And to do this, you will need to free the last Guardian from being imprisoned by his peers, and that's pretty much it, actually. From there on out, it's almost exclusively gameplay. So what exactly are we dealing with in terms of gameplay? Well, this is a single-player, first-person shooter in a retro throwback style, but with some pretty significant changes to the gameplay formula compared to most. So a lot of the things you normally expect from retro shooters are certainly there. Things like non-regenerating health. You have to find health pickups scattered in the world, or use the life siphon power-up to be able to steal life from enemies when you take them down. In addition, you will find armor pickups scattered around the world, and these range from things like helmets to actual suits of armor to just armored shards. And on top of just the basic armor you can also find dark armor, which is a separate armor count that further reduces the damage you take. Although unlike with the regular armor and health pickups, which are scattered fairly liberally throughout the levels, dark armor pickups are almost always either tucked away in secret areas, and so you'll have to just do a bunch of secret hunting to find them, or they're in chests, which require you to find a chest key somewhere in the level to be able to open them. So the dark armor pickups end up being somewhat rare, and you had to put in some work to get to them. Beyond that, much like you would expect, you have a pretty decent arsenal of weapons available to you, which generally fills specific roles. The first weapon you'll have access to is the Blade of Ruination, which is a wrist-mounted blade that allows you to carve up enemies with fairly weak melee strikes with the primary fire, or use the secondary fire to charge up an attack, which is actually very powerful and will launch you quite some distance, so it actually ends up being an essential tool for navigating the levels, and they do take that into consideration when it comes to the level design. And after you get the Blade of Ruination, you will gradually gain access to all the other weapons in the game, starting with the revolver, which is pretty much what it sounds like, except that it is a single shot with the primary fire, and then a triple shot with the secondary fire, because it is a 3-barreled revolver. And then from there, you'll gain access to things like the shotgun, which is firing both barrels with the primary fire, and charging up a shot that shoots out and then explodes to launch pellets in all sorts of different directions with the secondary fire, a fang launcher, which is sort of like the Quake nail gun in that it is a projectile-based machine gun type thing, and the secondary fire causes it to shoot far more rapidly. And these are going to be your more or less workhorse weapons. Everything else is going to be pretty situational. Things like the cyst launcher, which launches more or less balls of acid that explode when they hit things on contact, or they will attach to surfaces if they don't directly impact an enemy, and when an enemy wanders close, or if you wander too close, then it will explode and then do damage to whatever's near it. And then the secondary fire for it launches 3 of those orbs in quick succession, and they start bouncing around the environment till eventually they just start sticking to things. Beyond that, you have the slag cannon, which is a fairly rapid-fire projectile weapon with the primary fire, and then the secondary fire launches basically rockets. Then there's the lance, which is basically your railgun, and the secondary fire on that is a shield. Then there's the crystallizer, which launches a stream of energy with the primary fire, and it will actually arc to the next nearest enemy, which is pretty cool. But then the secondary fire launches a single powerful blast that will freeze enemies into crystal statues, and then that crystal statue enemy can then basically be used as a prism to launch the primary fire beam off in different directions as well, or you can just shatter it with a melee attack. And then finally you get the mace, which is basically what it sounds like as the melee weapon as a primary fire, only the trick with it is that it doesn't use ammunition like any of the other weapons. Whenever you kill an enemy with the primary fire, it absorbs that enemy's soul, and then once you fully charge the mace, which is after 10 kills, then you can use the secondary fire to launch a wave of exploding projectiles. It's a solid arsenal, and it generally feels pretty good to use. The problem is that even early on in the game, it starts throwing a lot of bullet sponge enemies at you, and that really puts a damper on the effectiveness of the arsenal, and makes it so that you're going to spend a lot more ammo than you really thought you would in combat. Which might be a bit of an issue for you, especially depending on which difficulty setting you're on, because even on the normal difficulty setting like I was playing it on, there were moments even early on in the game where I was dangerously close to running out of ammo. And this isn't a situation like in, say, Doom Eternal or Shadow Warrior 3, where you have a melee weapon that you can use to just immediately get a bunch of ammo back. Now, in this particular case, the melee weapons just do damage, and if you want to replenish your ammo, you have to find ammo pickups. And it's perfectly fine to go with the purely ammo pickup route, it's just that when you do that, you need to make sure that the player actually feels like they have enough ammo most of the time to be able to handle pretty much anything that's being thrown at them, and you don't really get that feeling from Wrath, because the further you get into the game, the more not only enemies in general it throws at you, but the more bullet sponge enemies it starts throwing at you, and so you end up feeling like you actually have to conserve your ammo as much as possible so that you can deal with those bullet sponge enemies, rather than just feel comfortable using the weapons as the situation calls for them and just getting into a general groove of gameplay. And if Wrath were many other retro throwback shooters out there, then that would probably be fine. But unfortunately, there is one decision that the developers of Wrath made that kind of ruins the entire experience. And that is the level design. Instead of going for a linear progression like you would expect from most retro throwback shooters, they decided to go with a hub world that connects to the various levels you'll actually be playing on. The idea here being that there are 3 individual hubs which each connect to 5 levels apiece, and you can tackle those 5 levels that are connected to the hub that you're currently in any order that you want. And then once you've completed all of the levels within a particular hub world, then you can move on to the boss fight for that hub world, and then move on to the next hub. This is definitely an odd, but certainly not unwelcome choice for a retro throwback shooter, but the problem is that because the developers aren't necessarily going to know which levels you tackle in which order, they have to design them all around a general difficulty standard, and they have to design them all with the general progression of the game in mind. So instead of going into levels and feeling like everything is very carefully crafted so that you'll be introduced to new enemy types in a manner to where you can kind of learn how they work, the encounter design generally just ends up being, here, let's just throw a bunch of enemies at the player and just have them deal with it. It also negatively affects the weapon progression. While you'll certainly have quite the arsenal by the end of the first hub world, you still feel pretty under-equipped because the game will start throwing enemies at you that are really best dealt with using weapons you acquire later on in the game. Only you're still stuck with the pistol, the shotgun, and the Blade of Ruination because the game has been very slow to get you the new weapons that you really need to deal with the new enemies. Obviously, it's not necessarily a deal breaker, you can work around it, but it does get kind of frustrating. But far more frustrating than just this kind of wonky progression is the combination of the game's save system with the fact that the levels are simply way too damn long. The only level in the game that took me less than 25 minutes to finish was the tutorial. And keep in mind, that is with me generally playing through games a lot more quickly than most other people, and of course I wasn't going for all of the secrets or anything like that. But the fact that I play games more quickly than most has really no meaning when every single level in the game is absolutely massive and is packed with several hundred enemies each. And I do mean that. We're talking upwards of 300 plus enemies in single levels. And for very large swaths of the game, it's just going to be the same handful of enemies over and over and over and over again, and that gets incredibly tedious. That tedium is only made far worse by the game's save system, which thankfully you can disable and switch it back to being a regular infinite saves like with any other retro shooter. But the default save system, the way the game is meant to be played, you have only autosaves in the form of a single autosave when you enter a level, and an autosave that occurs whenever you find a shrine somewhere in the level, where there's usually only 1 or 2 shrines in the entire level. And when you go up to a shrine, it triggers the autosave and it will heal you to maximum. But the other save option you have are soul tethers, which are items that you find scattered in the levels, and those are quick saves. So you just plop those down wherever you wanted to have a quick save, and then whenever you end up dying, which is definitely something that can happen in this game, because it can be pretty difficult, you're given the option to either return to a shrine, or return to a soul tether, or simply to restart the level. Now, here's the problem with the way that's set up. Because the shrines heal you to max, the temptation there is to save them for when you really need them. That leaves soul tethers, the maximum number of which you can carry depends on which difficulty setting you're on, and regardless of which are a limited item. Now, of course, the temptation there is because you have a limited number of soul tethers, you don't want to use those unless you really need them. But unlike with the shrines, where there's only 1 or 2 of them per level, and when you use the shrine, it is completely depleted and cannot be used again, the game practically showers you in soul tethers, so really the only reason you wouldn't use them is if you forget to. Which I certainly did a fair few times, and which always was incredibly irritating because more often than not, I was saving the shrines for when I really needed them, and forgot to use a soul tether, and ended up having to restart entire levels. Which wouldn't be a problem if they were, say, normal retro first-person shooter levels that take maybe 5 or 10 minutes to complete. No, these are levels that take 30 minutes to an hour to complete. So restarting the entire level got incredibly irritating. And the most annoying part about all this is I really don't know why they set the save system up this way. Considering the game practically showers you in soul tethers, it's not like you're ever really gonna run out of them, and so in effect you have infinite saves anyway. The entire point of limiting when and where a player can save the game is to help control the difficulty, so if you're not going to use that to actually control the difficulty, and are just gonna throw saves at the player like candy, then there's just no reason to use a save system like that. So, I guess word of advice to anybody who's interested in playing the game, just don't bother with the regular save system. Don't bother with the whole soul tethers and shrines only thing. Just go into the options menu and enable the infinite save setting and just play it like you would any other retro shooter. And in fact, that's probably going to be a better option for you in the long run, because you'll be able to break up the gameplay a lot more easily than just using soul tethers and shrines. Of course, we wouldn't necessarily have this problem to begin with if the levels were structured more like an actual retro shooter, and thus you ended up having far smaller levels that were much more densely packed and more tightly controlled than these large, sprawling levels full of hundreds of enemies that take you 30 minutes to an hour to complete. And really, that's the big takeaway here. On the surface, the developers of Wrath Aeon of Ruin designed the game to where, if it were a standard-style retro throwback shooter with a linear progression, it probably would work really well. It's got a solid arsenal, the actual mechanics of moving around, and the secret exploration, the way the blade is used for traversing the environments, that all works really well. It's just that the level design and the sheer amount of enemies in those levels just drags the entire thing down from what should be an exhilarating experience into ultimately a very tedious one that you can really only tolerate in short bursts. I'm certainly not saying you won't be able to have fun playing Wrath Aeon of Ruin. I certainly had moments where I was actually enjoying it. It's just that those were simply fleeting moments in a sea of tedium, and as such, I really can't recommend Wrath overall unless you get it on sale for a good discount. And that's really a shame, because I was actually looking forward to Wrath Aeon of Ruin, and, well, it just ended up being disappointing. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested, and every bit really does help out. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.